Hi, good morning, George and Matt. How are you guys doing today?
No,
Hey,
not
good
bad.
morning.
Good morning.
Doing
Good
Excellent,
morning.
excellent.
We're all being safe in the snowy weather. I hope.
Yes.
All right, everyone, thank you so much, regular viewers, for joining us. And if you're here for the first time, we are Valiant. We are a managed IT service provider in New York City, but we have a national reach. And if you want to learn more about us, as always, please watch our previous episodes. We've been doing these streams now for a year and a half,
Yeah.
right, Matt? Am I
It's
right?
been a while.
It's been a long time.
It's been since June 4th, 1997.
Yeah,
I remember sitting down with George. We were listening to Real Big Fish's Sellout, and we said, hey, man, let's do a live stream.
Of course, live streams didn't exist back then, but sure.
We're innovators.
Real big.
Innovators.
Real big fish. That's a deep cut, Matt.
yeah, we were like Pixar designing all their great movies, like
Exactly.
that one breakfast that they did where they like figured out Wall-E 12 years before.
Exactly.
And really quick, guys, watch all our episodes and to learn more about us. Or to join the conversation, please comment on YouTube and LinkedIn, and you can watch our live stream via Twitter. Follow us at The Valiant Way. And we do watch the DMs. We do answer things. We're very responsive and interactive. So please feel free to ask questions. And sometimes it changes the direction of our streams. We really enjoy building content we know can be used. All right. With all that out of the way, all the housekeeping, let's get on to the topic. I really love this stream. When I started in IT, I would have really watched this a lot. We're talking about the acronym episode, or we're going to talk about acronyms that are common to the IT world to kind of clear up some of the mystery, because it can be pretty confusing, right, George?
Yeah, I think a lot of this is a lot of the acronyms you see in the compliance cyber realm, and these get really confusing really fast. So we're just trying to take a little bit of time and just go through some of the things you may see and kind of give some edges to it, because acronyms, I think, are an enemy of information. So let's get started. So
yeah, great.
Matt, you want to do our first one on there? Sure. Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah,
So,
the first thing that I'm going to ask you guys to go into, as our salespeople, our big talkers, our experienced ones, is the CIA Triad. It's something that we've talked about quite a bit over the past few weeks, especially when we had Tim here, but it makes sense to kind of give it its own time to shine today. So
exactly,
let's get into it.
Sure. The CIA Triad is really like the kind of core, kind of philosophical meat of cybersecurity. And a lot, if you're doing any cybersecurity training, it'll almost always universally be one of the first things that are taught, because it really puts it in context what the role, responsibilities, and things that are like important to any organization. So it really starts with confidentiality, and really confidentiality is access to control, separate organizations, and sensitivity. And part of it's like the practical aspect of it is encryption, and not having people have access to data that they don't have need for access to. And this really ties deeper into some of the other stuff we'll be talking today around privacy and some of the compliance frameworks that are important. So they're all really intermingled. And what happens, I think, is that we should definitely start with the CIA Triad and our next piece. So let's just keep focused. I'm sorry. It's easy to tangent, and it's almost like a dendrite growing out the other way. So confidentiality. The next one is integrity. Mm-hmm. And that's really ensuring that the people can get access to what needs to happen. They can get access to the things they need to do their jobs. Protects it from data loss, and also it prevents it from once again it kind of overlaps with confidentiality, where it's not allowing the people to have.
I'm gonna jump in with it. I'm going to jump in with an example to make it simpler. It's about guaranteeing that data makes it from point A to point B untouched, unfettered, not modified. Right. It's like, I'm sure you guys remember playing the telephone game in school where you start off by saying something to the person, and each time you go past to that next person, it changes just a little bit. Right. The authentic message that started with is always going to be different by the end because of little
Right.
nuances.
That's
of
a
how
really
it's
good
being
metaphor,
said.
I think.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's a good way to put it.
The integrity part of the CIA Triad are steps to take to prevent that from happening.
It's also making sure the person who sent the message is actually the person who sent the message
Yes.
or wrote the document.
Yes.
You know,
Yeah.
the technical term is non-repudiation, but it's a really important piece of it because, you know, how do I know the email that was sent is actually from the person who sent it?
Right.
That sort of thing. So that's a good, and the telephone example is perfect because as we all know, as it travels through the line, it changes just a little bit. And that's what encryption and some of like a hash can help you kind of keep the message exactly the same.
That's exactly it. That's how you. That's one of the ways to guarantee that something has remained the same between points A and points B. And let's just go ahead and thank Mrs. Ross, my 6th grade teacher, for that.
Yes,
that was literally it. I was having the flashback as I was thinking of it. And then that leads us to availability. So let's
correct. And availability is as when we it's having things online and usable by staff and systems at all times. A good way to think of availability is securing an environment so it's not offline, or having backups that work,
or visiting our episode on operational resilience. I mean, that's really what that all comes down to. It's about building systems that are highly available, despite certain risks that exist and that we all have to accept to some point, whether that be a failure of equipment or facilities related issues, power outages, internet outages, you name it. You know, there are approaches you take to reduce those risks as much as possible.
Global pandemic. That might be an availability.
A little bit of a stretch on that one. I don't think that would ever happen.
Talking crazy, George.
Come on. You know what? I'm done with the CIA Triad. Let's move on to GRC at that point.
Right. And I think the GRC Triad is a great segue because in so much ways.
Just really quick, didn't mean to interrupt, but do they actually refer to it as a triad? I decided just to use the graphic because it translates well as far as I'm concerned.
I like triad, but just 3. You know, 3 is always a tree.
We're gonna have to trademark that thing. The GRC Triad.
So I don't think it's a triad, but we're gonna use it. We're gonna use the GRC Triad because, and I guess you know, CIA is very like technical in so many ways. Has very technical like bones and underneath it. GRC is much more a business aspect of a way of looking at. You know, governance is the way an organization runs policies, procedures, how you actually do the thing that you're supposed to be doing and controlling it from a management perspective. A really important piece of running a business. And it has some legal ramifications for not following governance. One of the things we'll talk about later is Sarbanes-Oxley, which is, and some of the other frameworks. You know, Sarbanes is a very old kind of accounting and business legislation, but that's a good example of governance, you know. And then next up is risk. Risk is one of those terms that's like, oh, it's risk. You know, what does that mean? But it has a kind of a real thing. It's looking at a situation and seeing what the possible outcomes and how they can be a negative impacts. And I think that's a really important way. And you know, and governance conforms risks. They're interwoven with each other because at times your governance should lower your risk.
And I'm assuming that when we're talking about risk with respect to GRC, we're also talking about quantifying identified risks to understand their impact on a business from like a financial and other standpoint.
That's a great way. That's a really good point, Matt. Thank you. You know, it's qualified. You know, it's qualified and quantitative and qualitative risk. Some is like, you know, the kind of subjective. Like, I think this is going to go bad. Other ones you could say, hey, if our office burns down, it's going to cost us X dollars of like not having the replacement equipment and all the other pieces around that. So there's a lot of insurance risk kind of falls really much into the insurance. Insurance is a risk mitigation. So it's an important thing. And we could spend, we've had a risk episodes and.
Well, I was going to say, it's sort of what we always say. It's the if. It's not if, it's when. Correct. And I think it's such an important aspect of it because it's just, I think we've talked about this, but the way you handle the fallout of like an incident is really important. It's just as important planning that as the mitigating the risk.
The response and recovery is just as important.
And last is compliance.
Yeah.
And compliance is different than the other two in that there's outside forces or third parties or legislation. and it's meeting that compliance standard. And we talked about it last week, but just to reiterate, compliance is not cybersecurity and compliance, and they're not the same thing. They're very different. They're either interwoven, but they're not. Being compliant does not mean secure, and being secure does not mean compliant. There's separate steps and there's separate actions that must be taken. A lot of compliance is documentation, which is something that as an IT person, I think that most IT people hate documentation more than life itself. Even though we say we love it, we all hate doing it. We like when it's done really well for us. It's kind of like dinner. Like you want dinner on the table when you walk in the door. Or,
in 30 minutes or less, or it's free.
30 minutes or less, right? You want that Domino's. You want that to show up. But you don't want to really know how it got there. And, number one, when we talk to customers, we talk to internally, we find that documentation is number one, and compliance has a very heavy documentation component to it. So I think that's why it's such a hard. I mean, it's hard for a multitude of reasons, but for most small and medium businesses, they don't document things very well by nature of small and medium business. So that's why it's such a tough.
And unfortunately, in many areas, documentation is seen as more of a luxury than anything else, because there's so many other things that will often take priority just for general operations in a small business. So totally understandable, but the kind of thing that just has to happen. And I think we've all learned our lessons in that one way or another in the workplace over the years.
Absolutely. So anyway, I hope that helps to clear up some GRC. If someone wants to have a deeper talk about it, these are one of these topics that we're probably going to revisit over time because they're evolving. We get more in depth. We'll have a separate episode just on one, but just to put it in perspective, because these two kind of models inform a lot of the underlying compliance regulations that we're going to talk about next. So the next one is really important. Some common regulations or compliance frameworks or things that you may come across in your day-to-day business need. There's one that here in New York that went to law in March 2020. Knowing that it went into law in March 2020 kind of made it not enforced very often just because of what's happening, I think, with the COVID pandemic. But these laws are on the books, and that means at some point they will be enforced. The wheels of justice move slowly, but they move forward.
But they do,
it's going to happen, and you don't want to be the company. So that happens. New York Shields. It stands for Stop Hacks. A little goofy. And Improve Electronic Data Security Act. So it's kind of a silly term, but I think it gives it some. It's pretty forward thinking for its time. It's one of the most stringent cyber privacy laws on the books. I think one thing just before we get deeper into the conversation about compliance, a lot of compliance regulations start out are very much privacy laws or privacy acts, and privacy has a component. One of the components of privacy that's really important to keep in mind is that any organization collecting data has an obligation to keep that data secure. And I think that where these are overlapping and a little confusing, even myself over just working in this, is that is this a privacy law that has a cybersecurity component, or is this a cybersecurity law? There really isn't any cybersecurity law per se. There's more privacy laws that require you to have a cybersecurity
approach to meet the needs of it. Right. Absolutely. But at the end of the day, I think privacy is typically the root, because that is an issue that every single person has. It doesn't matter if you're in a workplace or not. Privacy is a bit of a human right that we need to be able to maintain, and we're doing that through electronic mechanisms.
I'm sorry, man, go ahead.
No, I was gonna say, George, you put it in a way earlier that really hit home for me, of like, once you have data, you're a steward of that data. Like, it is correct. The word steward was really good for me, because I was like, oh yeah, it's like, it is, you already said it in the stream, but I love that you use that word, because it's just, you can't just blame it on I don't understand this stuff. It's like, you have to learn how to take care of this data if you have it.
Correct. Or every organization that collects data, and I don't know of any organization that does not have some personal data somewhere. Right. If you have one employee, you have personal data that you are in stewardship of for that.
If you have one if you're a business and you're one employee, great. If you have one customer, there you go. There's
Correct.
the data right there.
And
You're making transactions. You're going to have their information to some extent. I mean, name, phone number, address. You might not have payment details depending on how you're doing things, but just the fact that you have some way to get in touch with them, a contact method.
It's not anonymized, right? It's data that you can identify a real person. PII. And I think the other piece that's important to keep in mind is that that invariably we are probably violating these laws at times because people don't know. But the kind of classic ignorance of the law is no defense. Mm-hmm. So that's why we want to do a lot of these series around here. So kind of bringing back the New York Shield Act, it's important. And say, well, I don't work in the state of New York, but you have a customer in the state of New York, you are liable to this law. You have to, it has a pretty broad data collection and data security component, and it's fairly rigorous for what it is. And I think that it came out of a large number of data breaches that happened here in New York, and obviously data breaches are ongoing.
Yeah, mostly the ones that we're talking about were around 2016, which I believe is what really sparked all of this. And I think that the New York Shield's also great because it does help much better define what a breach is.
Correct. It gives some edges.
Yeah, if something is defined as a breach and it takes place, and there are very rigid guidelines around what a breach can be considered, then it's much easier to determine the most appropriate response. And it's also easy to understand the legal ramifications of not taking the right steps after it happens because it is so well laid out. There's it's about removing ambiguity among was this a breach? Was this not a breach? Was this an error in judgment? Was this something that has a legal consequence? Well, we have these to help, really kind of create those strong dividing lines between what's okay and what's not.
Yeah.
Exactly. And I think that the next law that is in line with New York Shield is the CPRA, or California Privacy Rights Act of 2020. This is a replacement law or amendment of the CCPA, which is a original Privacy Act that went into I think law in 2017 and 2018. And it kind of actually spends the rights of that law and makes it much more, even more.
It's more stringent. It's
right? Complicated.
I think that a lot of the earlier versions of things were put together when the technology itself wasn't necessarily as understood as it is now, or as widely used. Even over the past few years, things that we work with technology online has just changed so drastically, and it's made it much easier to define what's going on here. And it's a lot like New York Shield. And one thing I appreciate about it, or at least the way it's been written about multiple times, is that they're very, very concise with the language and what's right and what's not. I mean, even if you look at our notes, it's the right to know about personal information a business collects about you as an individual.
Right.
That's a very direct, item to have in there. The right to delete personal information that's been collected on you. The right to opt out of the sale of your personal information. If you don't want your information going to third parties, you're being protected by CPRA as long as it's being abided by the companies that you're working with. And then, of course, I think the most important there is the right to non-discrimination for exercising your CPRA rights. If you're telling someone that you don't want to be on their list, you don't want to hear from them, you don't want your information to be sold, they don't really have a means of recourse in a legal sense.
Correct. They're obligated legally to not punish you or to
legally obligated to simply comply and move on. I mean, that's I think the way to look at that. And again, all those things are here to not only protect people's privacy, but also to offer some transparency into how their information is being used. I mean, we sit here, and I know, George, you've said it a number of times over the past year, data is the new currency or something similar to that.
It is.
And,
that's how Google is worth more than General Electric.
But if you can look at yourself online in the form of currency or something like that, you need to know what's happening with that. You don't want to be laundered, right?
Correct.
Yep.
It didn't work, but it sounded pretty good for a second. Just don't think about it.
I see what you're doing there.
Laundered. I'm like, I would like to be,
exactly.
Yeah.
So I think the next regulation that is kind of acronym busting, the GDPR,
it's the king of the monsters as far as privacy law goes.
A little overwhelming sometimes, I think.
It's actually really difficult. Like, I mean, it's like, I've taken some classes on this, and it's just hard, man. I don't think anyone's even fully compliant with it. It went into law almost 7 years ago in 2016, or 6 years ago, and now it's been in a full implementation 2018. There's been some challenges against it. It's kind of really complex. It's from the EU, but it has a lot of teeth for regulation. Because if you do business in the EU, you could be subject to a massive fine, $20 million or 4% of your gross worldwide global revenue. So and that hasn't been enforced yet, but it's on the books. And invariably, someone's going to find a methodology to enforce it eventually. And it's just a really tough thing to comply with. There's a lot of different regulations around data stewardship, the data subject, and what's called the DPO, or the data protection officer, which is a pretty strict responsibility, a liability for the company and what happens to data. So they have very similar to GDPR, the California Act.
There we go. See, the acronyms are tripping you up too.
It's so much.
There's so many. There's so many. And these are broader scale ones too.
Right, these are huge ones. These have, and once again, U.S. companies are not necessarily required to be part of GDPR, but if you do business in Europe, you're responsible. And to make it even more complicated, with Brexit, there is a UK version of it, which is not really called GDPR, but I'm not even sure what it's called, because this thing's, I'm sure that we're not experts in UK privacy laws, but it's you're adding another layer of complexity. So I'm a U.S. business. I do business in Europe, mainland Europe, the EU zone, Brexit, United Kingdom, and now I have all these different laws. And then you start adding in some Asia Pacific. It gets really hard. And how do you
shop local?
Seriously. So I mean, we could do a whole episode on GDPR, but basically, it's one of the big things is similar. It's a right of knowing what happens to your data, where it goes, and one of the big things that came out is the right to be forgotten. I want my data to go away. I don't want to be part of your data sets anymore. There's a lot of feedback that's negative. Like people don't, at least a lot of tech companies that are collecting data, they don't want to forget people. They want to keep you in the database forever. You are the currency.
I think, at least in my head, as you're saying that's great. But you know what? I don't want to be in your database the next time you get breached.
Yeah.
Correct. Well, therein lies this. And GDPR also has a very, very, very strong security component around the data use and data classification, and protecting of that data. So really important piece of it. So I mean, we have so much to cover. I mean, like 6 minutes left. So
we're good though. If we need to pick up the last one or so early next week during our stream, we can. But talking about Shop Local, let's get into PCI really quickly. I mean, that stands for the Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard, and unlike some of the things we've talked about so far, this is an industry regulation. So it's not coming from a government body, but from the industry itself. I think probably like Visa and other organizations probably play a significant role there.
It's a consortium of the credit card processors accepting a certain level of standard. So really what it comes down to is if you're a merchant and you want to take and utilize merchant services, credit card processing, you have to comply. There's a lot of ways that you can be compliant, and it really depends on how much transaction value you do. If you're running your own credit card processing or using a third-party processor.
There are four different levels based on volume, I think.
Based on volume and value. And it's up. PCI DSS is not a significant amount of work for a company. And as the company gets larger, the more sites it has, it gets really tricky at retail. Based on,
well, I'm sure we've run into needs related to point of sale systems for retail customers and things like that before.
Correct. We have, and there's a very long and sort of complex attestation process to where you can self-attest to a point, but if you have a large enough volume, you have to have an outside
Well, I think that even at the lowest level, you still need to have a vulnerability scan. I think that no matter what,
Correct.
even if it's technically okay to have done in-house, it should not be. That's a third-party role.
Correct. Yeah, correct.
Yeah.
They want that outside validation of your internet-facing services.
I think we all want outside validation. If you write something, I read it. If I write something, someone else reads it. You need that second set of eyes, no matter what it is.
Exactly.
Because at the end of the day, if there's a mistake made, you're going to be the one who's paying for it anyway. And it's a self-preserving kind of like expense as far as I'm concerned. Let's continue on to Sarbanes-Oxley. This is one that I talked a little bit about last week in my interactions with it. So I don't think we need to go too far into it, especially since it's not really a cybersecurity oriented thing. It's really more about an obligation to provide accurate proof of what's going on financially within a company.
It all came out of a lot of the fraud from WorldCom and Enron back in the early 2000s. Those names might not mean a lot to a lot of people.
That's fascinating.
I still have a UUNet T-shirt someplace. I'm never letting that thing go. It's vintage.
So I think people say SOX compliance. And it's SOX, Sarbanes-Oxley. But then another one, and the next one that's really confusing is SOC.
Yeah, let's just jump right into that.
Do you have a SOC? And this is the one that I find that most people get, like, especially we have a number of customers that are, hey, do we have SOC? Are we SOC compliant? And I'm like, okay, what do you mean?
Well, there's context because the SOC is also a security operations center, a place where work goes on. So this is one of those the acronyms that sounds like another acronym that also means something else in a different context within the same industry in a very close capacity. Right. So this is the worst acronym in the world.
It's a really terrible one. So it's a security organization control. It's actually from the AICPA, which is the American Association of Certified Public Accountants.
They're accountants. They should be dealing with numbers, not these letters. That's the problem.
Exactly. That happens. Excel doesn't handle letters very well. But really, it's about controls. And it started out with financial controls, but as accounting kind of took over a larger piece of organizations and audit and external validation, it became a pretty recognizable standard, especially if you are handling other customers' sensitive or PII data. So it basically controlled that data, and it started out financials, but it kind of moved to be like us all data handling. And this is not exact definitions of it. I'm sure you can go online and read thousands of pages of compliance documentation, this is very confusing.
This is the Cliff Notes. These are the Cliff Notes leading up to the next episode. That's what we really want to talk about before we're done. But we got a little bit more to get through. So let's
exactly. So there's 3 levels of SOC plus some extra type 1, type 2. I guess complicated, but really fundamentally, SOC 1 is internal audit of your documentation. SOC 2 is the compliance and validation by a third party. And there's another one called SOC 3, which is a public report that you can share because it has redacted amounts of data that could be used in an attack. Really important thing. Almost every SOC 2, someone will put a SOC 2 label on their website, say, hey, we're SOC 2 compliant. And if you ask for that SOC 2 report, you have to sign an NDA or be an engaged customer or a partner. No one's just going to give you a SOC 2 report because it's kind of exposing how things work.
It's something that I had to do when we worked with a couple of different HIPAA compliant vendors for customer needs. And I remember going through the process and the amount of paperwork that I had to get in order to even be exposed to that was considerable. It really was.
So I'll give a good, I think it's a good example, real world example would be if I'm doing my due diligence for a customer, and they would like us to review a third party company that they're looking to work with. A lot of times I'll say, hey, they have a SOC 2, they're SOC 2 compliant, they have a SOC 2 report. Great, and let's go through the process of signing the NDA or getting whatever we need to get that report, review it, and then we would retain it for them so that they would be able to say, hey, do you have a third-party risk management tool process? Yes, we do. If they're a service provider, we collect their SOC 2 report, that sort of thing. So that sort of SOC 2 report might come into play, and I think that we can, we can see where it has a practical aspect of it. Unfortunately, a lot of people ask for it, but it's a pretty complex process to get your SOC 2 or SOC 3 report, because you have to have this outside validation, you have to document things. It's hard. It's a lot of work, and you have to decide if it's really worth it for your organization based on what you're providing for your customers. So that's a really 1 million mile an hour, million foot high view of SOC. It's a really powerful tool. So beyond that, we have one more thing we want to talk about today. I know Megan has to go because we're talking a lot. So Megan, I'll close it up. Thank you so much for joining us, as always. So
again, the acronym episode is I love it. It's a constantly good reminder for me too, just to refresh.
You love it so much that there's going to be a sequel. Look at that. It's been greenlit.
I pushed for it. I really fought for it. I wanted it. All right. Bye, guys.
Bye,
See you later.
So the next one up is another source of, I think, confusion in many places. We've been seeing it for the past about 2 years now in kind of the SMB spaces, the NIST, National Institute of Standards Technology, cyber framework. That's kind of like the underlying philosophy of how to be secure, a security model, if you want to call it that. That's why it has this kind of cool graphic and, identify, protect, detect, respond, recover. Kind of gives you the full life cycle of a cyber program. And there's a bunch of different compliance, special reports, special publications you might see. Tim, who's on, hey Tim, shout out, Golden, spent a lot of time kind of talking about this a bit, and how it's a lot of these. If you work with the federal government or different local governments, you might be required to be 853 compliant, or CMMC required, or 800-171 compliant, and they all have very specific levels and things that you have to do and proof of it. But really, what it comes down to is this is a starting point to begin a cyber program that's in conjunction with an overall cyber privacy overlaying one another, because they inform one another, and then put together it with like a whole just stance that your company's taken. I think the term that we've seen kicked around quite a bit, Matt, is cyber resilience. That's kind of the
you slap resilience onto anything, it sounds great.
It sounds cool, right? So
lactose resilience,
you name it. It's just going to make everything sound better. See,
antibiotic resistance. That's a bad one. Resilient. I don't know. Maybe. Anyway, yes, it's all part of it. And once again, it all goes kind of reinforces and reinforms that GRC component, which is the business aspect of all this compliance and cybersecurity. Because doing this for just doing its sake is a total waste. It just doesn't make sense, right? You have to do it in the context of your business need. How does it protect you, protect your customers, protect your employees? And these are all tools in a toolbox to build a kind of an overall
structure. It's a scaffolding. Correct. It's something to start with. It's like, you ever gone to learn how to dance and you get the little footsteps on the ground? Yeah, it's something for you to latch onto that you can then use to build off of.
Chord progressions, right? If you learn how to play guitar, or any one of the kind of stepping stones. And the idea here is that the framework just helps you just start and pick a framework and start. That's really, it's like much like any process or any methodology. Pick one, and there's a lot of them out there. There's there's NIST, there's CIS, there's ISO, there's a couple other ones out there, but they're all very similar and they all map somewhat to each other. And the idea here is that once you start a program and you start developing the documentation and the processes and the training for the folks that work in your organization or your partners, you can really protect yourself and your business, and from both attacks and from any kind of compliance violations that may have a cost in both real dollars from penalties or reputation loss or damaged customer relationships.
It also just goes a long way in keeping a clean house.
It's you're not wrong. It's a way. It's keeping yourself together. So anyway, I think this is a great episode. I know I keep talking about this for hours on end. It's something I'm really passionate about. I know Matt is as well. We spent a lot of time on this, but we could, NIST framework might get its own episode just in itself, like what each one of these means, because it's a lot of confusion around it. Like, what does detect really mean? As opposed to say like, oh yeah, we have a problem. Well, what does that mean?
Well, yeah, I think it'd be great if we went through each one of these and we really kind of got down to practical application versus theory. I think some of these are how you think something out, others are how you execute, and let's kind of try and turn it into a thing where we have those into two different columns: action versus prep or planning, and break it down a little bit in a way that's really easy to wrap your head around. Theory,
doing, and sometimes I think there's always a misconnection of the doing and like best intentions, and then nothing happens. So there's a lot around that. So. And it's been a year since we built a roadmap to compliance, and we're going to go back to it in 2 weeks because we want to really give some more of these acronym breakdowns, because we think that this is one of the biggest problems. People get a ton of acronyms thrown at them, and it's just confusing. I get confused at times. You myself, I slipped up today.
Yeah, look,
so you do.
So yeah, next week we're going to do another one of these acronym type episodes that focus on cybersecurity related acronyms. And if anyone watching has one that they'd like for us to clear up for them, just submit it on the form, and we'll include it in everything for next week. And I think we're also probably going to want to plan to do this for a little bit longer next week and really get the time in to cover everything in a little bit more detail. This was great, though. I'm really happy that we got through this.
Yeah.
It's funny you say that the amount of passion that goes into this stuff. Acronyms are probably the one thing in the English language that honestly drives me nuts.
I know you dangerous.
So there's like this desire to make sure that we're getting out the right information, and then to move on to whatever's next, which we don't even know yet, and that's going to be fun. So after 2 weeks from now, we'll be talking about whatever we're doing here next. But until then, everybody stay secure and stay compliant. Right?
Thanks for joining us, and we love it. If you have questions, fire them off to us, and you join us at thevaliantway.com. Thanks, everyone. Have a great week.